Welcome to The Deepening, a podcast that explores the inner journey and its relationship to our outer life through the lens of Jungian psychology, spirituality, and personal transformation. I'm your host, Suzanne Larue. Let's journey inward together. In today's episode, I speak with journalist Maggie Jones, a longtime writer for the New York Times Magazine, whose work often explores the tender, unspoken experiences of human life. Maggie's writing has appeared in numerous publications, including The Washington Post, Mother Jones, and The Guardian. She's been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, a senior Ochberg Fellow at Columbia's Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and she currently teaches writing at the University of Pittsburgh. I hope you'll enjoy this rich conversation about presence, witnessing, and what it means to be fully alive. Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Suzanne.
So nice to see you. Thank you for being here.
I'm really glad to be here.
Your work touches on so many intimate and sometimes taboo experiences, from grief and death and even suicide to sexuality and aging. And I've found that you approach these subjects with such care and deep listening that really comes across in each of your stories. Today, I want to focus mostly on your piece, The Movement to Bring Death Closer, where you explore the practice of home funerals and how tending to and spending time with the bodies of our deceased loved ones can be healing and help us begin the transition process. How are you feeling about stepping back into this story with me today?
I reread it yesterday and I was like, whoa, that was a long time ago. Lots happened. But I also really cherish that story. It's one of my favorites because it was moving for me and I felt like I was on a mission to explain something very important.
For those who haven't read it, you followed our family in the days surrounding my mother Susan's death in the home vigil we held for her. You were with us during some deeply intimate and sacred moments, and you brought such reverence and thoughtfulness to the experience and the way you told the story. We felt genuinely comfortable with you, which I think says a lot about who you are and how you hold space.
Thank you.
So I'd love to begin by hearing what first drew you to this subject.
So, what first drew me to this subject was my own personal experience. I guess it was probably 12 years before I met you, 12 years before I really thought, oh, wait, there's a story here. My father had died, and my sister, who practices Tibetan Buddhism, had asked my mother, who is Catholic, if we could keep his body at home for 3 days. And my mom said, 1 day is good enough. And it was so important and moving to me in a way that I couldn't have imagined. Having that time and the lack of rush. And it's one of those stories that just must have been rolling around in my brain in some deep recesses somewhere. And at some point I thought, wait, other people must do this. And I don't hear about it a lot, but every time I told the story of the experience with my father, people were really curious, really moved, had lots of questions, thought about doing it in their own family. So that was the beginning. And then I went around looking for people who did this, who helped families with the transition, who could sort of tell the story and who could then find families for me, which is really the hardest part.
In the story that you tell about your family's experience, you spoke of sleeping in the room with your siblings and your father after he died.
I can't overemphasize how much it meant to me because my father had a chronic illness, but he then died more quickly than we expected. And I think, there's no getting around grief, of course, but it helped me sort of have some more time and to feel his presence in the room, even though he was no longer alive.
Yeah, my father slept in the room with my mother the first night after she died, and I think that really helped him. And as you know, my father just passed away just last month.
And I really liked your father so much. I was so sad to hear about it, but also was glad when you told me about his last years were full of adventures. And he was so important in my story because he was so thoughtful and also warm and open to me. I couldn't have done this story without everybody buying into having this stranger come around and hang out in the immediate days after your mom's death.
We actually did a home funeral with my father as well. And similar to the story of your father, his diagnosis was in January and he died at the end of March. So it was a complete shock diagnosis and it happened very quickly. And over the 2 nights that we kept him at home, my son and I each spent a night with him in his room, sleeping in the recliner by his bedside. And I think a lot of people might find that to be kind of morbid or creepy, but I found it really healing to just sleep in the room with him and just feel his physical presence, like you said, and feel that connection.
Yeah, it's so important, and I don't think I've told you this, but my mother died 4 years ago, and there were things that I brought in because of your family and because of reporting this story, and we had flowers everywhere, and we dressed and bathed her, and it was mostly just family, but of all ages came and sat with her, and people who had been skeptical had said, "Wow, that was really powerful." So the story and your experiences continue to play out in my own.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I have friends as well who have said that they read this story and that it inspired them. And I've now been to their home funerals for their deceased loved ones. So it has been really touching to see the way it's continued.
And were you did with your dad, did you all do it on your own? Did you have Heidi or somebody like her?
We did it on our own this time. And for the listeners who don't know, Heidi is the death doula who worked with our family to help us with my mom's home funeral and who was kind of the bridge between you and our family and some of the other families you worked with for the article.
Yeah, and I have to say, Suzanne, your family was exceptional because both that I got to talk to your mom before she died, that I got to talk to you extensively, and that, you'd have every right to sort of say at the last minute, "Oh, never mind, you can't come." But you let me come, and I was on a flight the day your mom had died, and knowing that any second you all could change your mind, but you were very brave and very open. And I assume this was part of your mission too. You wanted
Mm.
people to understand this.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was vulnerable to include you in that way, but as I said, you made it easy for us. It was easy to have you around, and we all felt that we liked you. My parents really liked you. But I do remember there was a point where I'm like, wait, she wants to be here possibly while my mom's dying? Wait, she wants to be here right after we're beginning to mourn the death. And so it was each time it was like a little bit more letting in. And I'm so glad we did.
Well, you made the story. I mean, stories like this don't happen without families who are willing to sort of share the time. And I think there were a couple moments when there were one or two things I think about the cremation. I'd asked you and you said, "Let me think about it." And then said, "Yes, come."
Well, there's a strong sense in the article of reclaiming a lost intimacy with death. And you write, there may be no other rite of passage around which we have become more passive. And you speak of how in many traditions people wash and prepare the bodies of their deceased, and that there's this therapeutic value of that physical contact, washing, dressing, kissing, touching. Why do you think that's so important?
Well, I mean, if you look at cultures, many, many, many cultures do some version of this. Traditional Jewish culture and in Muslim cultures and Japanese culture. And it makes sense because death is so jarring. Even when you've had a loved one with a chronic illness, you're never really ready. I mean, if somebody's really suffering and you feel like, yes, they need to be relieved from their suffering, but that doesn't mean that you are just ready to give somebody up right away physically. And so it's like a last loving gesture. I mean, I felt as a daughter with my mother that it was a way for me and my two sisters to take care of her one last time. But the gift was really to us. The gift is really to touch your mother's skin, which you always found so beautiful, and to do things like comb her hair and just to treat them lovingly, and also as just one more step as a way to say goodbye so it is not jarring. We were so scared of death, even creeped out by death and dead bodies, but it's still the body of your mother. It's still the body of your spouse. It's still the body of your child. And so that physical contact, I think it just helps with the transition.
I definitely experienced that. You wrote about several other families in this article, and some of them had experienced real tragedies, the death of a child. What was it like for you to step into those raw, private moments?
I mean, it is one of the most sort of raw and tender subjects one can possibly imagine. And so for people to share their stories with me, I mean, I often feel like this when I'm reporting. I very much felt it with this story, that I am awed by people's trust. And I feel like it's such a privilege for me to hear people's stories. I do think the story about the child who died in a car accident really got to me. I mean, that mom fought to get her kid home and to have a home funeral. And she did it in this way that one of the most moving things was that all the kids from the school came, or her grade came, and got to also say goodbye and leave things for her. And, another woman whose kids were not interested in having their brother who had died of a drug overdose home for a home funeral. But once it happened, they were all hanging out there too. I think the idea is scary and the reality is not so scary.
That story about the young girl and her classmates is just so moving that they were given an opportunity to say goodbye and to process by being able to see her one last time. I'm really moved by that.
Yeah, and she went on to be a home funeral guide after that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and, you said she had to fight to bring the body home, and I don't know if that's the story from the article, but just for the listeners, in your article, you talk a lot about how the history of the privatization of funerals and the funeral industry, they've lobbied to have all these laws about who can touch and move and tend to dead bodies. And so it's different from state to state, and oftentimes you really do have to struggle to know what your rights are and to get people to let you claim them.
Right, like the sort of idea that a body has to be embalmed. A body doesn't have to be embalmed. I mean, maybe if you're flying the body across the country, it does, but there's no reason, there's no health reason, there's no safety reasons. I mean, there are lots of, small, great family funeral homes that are ethical, but others, and often it's bigger ones and corporate ones, they suggest to families, you need to embalm, you need a fancy casket. In some states, you can drive your mom to a crematorium, and in other states, you can't. But it's not how we used to do death at all. It used to be all family oriented. And it was after the Civil War and later where it became an industry. There hadn't been an industry. You died on the farm and your family dressed you and bathed you and dug the ditch for your coffin and they put you in. Or maybe it was at the local graveyard at the church, but it was all within the family, within the community.
And like it's been done since the beginning of time.
Yes, yes.
Until very recently, yeah. And you mentioned it in the article, and we've talked about it, but I've often kind of seen a parallel to home birth. I mean, obviously there are times when we need the medical model, and we're grateful to have it in emergencies and things like that. But very often births are perfectly safe, and they can be done at home in the embrace of your family, in the comfort of your own home. But similarly, the experience of death has become privatized and institutionalized and medicalized, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And as a result, people are afraid of death and they kind of hand it over. And it's these really powerful and primal threshold moments that we kind of relinquish control over, unfortunately. And I think a lot is lost in that.
Yes, and, you don't have to think of this as like, "Okay, we're in this, we gotta do it for 3 days." I mean, some people talked about just don't rush to make the call to the funeral home or to 911 to come pick up a dead body. There's no emergency here. And so even if it's a day or 2 or 3 at home with a dead body is not your thing, please take some time to is there something you wanna say? I've heard some terrible horror stories. One woman who came in to see her mother who had just died, and the nurses were taking off her jewelry quickly. It's just like there's no rush at all. And sometimes you have to just put your foot down with the hospital and say, I need this room for a little bit. I need to be with this person and just talk to them and touch them. And you can do those things. And it helps to push back because then, hospitals learn to respond in kind too, if that's what people want.
I like that you pointed that out in the article about how it could just be staying a little bit longer, and because there's a spectrum of what people are going to be comfortable with. But I think what's most important, both whether we're talking about death or birth, is that people realize that they do have choices and that they can have a little bit more agency in the process and that they can find their own way that works for them in order to have it be more personal and to just really be able to savor the richness of what these experiences offer.
Yeah, we didn't dress and bathe my dad. That hadn't really occurred to us, and then we did with my mom, and so, yes, there are options, and I encourage people to ask questions. As you say, they do have choices.
So you mentioned this thing about the 3 days, and I do wanna come back to it because in the article, you talk about how in Tibetan Buddhism, bodies are not meant to be touched or moved for up to 3 days after death in order to allow the soul time to transition. And in the article, you quoted me as saying I wasn't sure if keeping my mom home for 3 days would be too woo-woo. And what I meant was that I didn't wanna just appropriate a spiritual tradition without understanding it, and without knowing if that was really what was right for us. So I was kind of like open to it, but I didn't know if we'd really need 3 days. But in the end, 3 days did feel right because after hosting visitors and helping my kids cope and supporting my dad, it was on that final morning that I was finally able to just really weep and just kind of throw myself on my mom's body and just fully feel my feelings. And then psychologically, I felt ready to let her go. So that was really powerful.
Well, and you were such a caretaker, right? You were doing all these things, as we often do when somebody dies, about taking care of other people, right? The small children or the remaining parent or whoever it is. And I was really struck by that was the time you finally got to go in the room by yourself and be with her and weep. And I see how that can take 3 days. There's so much going on, and you're being a good daughter the whole time, but you just need to be the daughter missing her mom at some
Yeah.
point.
Well, as we talked about before, my dad just passed away in March and he died at home. And my brother and I were both with him. And we did a home funeral. And this time we kept him home for 2 days. And it was hot out. And I was anxious about his body decomposing too much. So we called for him to be picked up after 2 days. But I didn't feel ready. Actually felt like he was being ripped away. I kept kissing his bald head and hugging him and even chased after him as they carried him away.
Oh,
And then that night, I had a dream, and he was by a river having trouble crossing over, and he seemed confused. And I said, Dad, you have to cross. We'll help you. And I sent my daughter to get him a boat, and she brought him a red kayak. And I told him, you have to take this across to the other side so we can stay connected, Dad. And we kind of helped him into the boat. And my final image from the dream was him kind of off in the distance, peacefully making the crossing. And it made me think maybe there is something archetypal and wise about this 3 day window, something deeply embedded in the psyche that kind of helps us let go. And I wish we'd kept him home one more day, but I also felt like somehow I'd really helped usher him over, across the threshold in the dream. Or maybe that was just my own unconscious giving me the closure that I needed. But it was interesting, and especially in light of our conversation about the 3 days. And was this like something that I really needed to do?
that's what a lot of death doulas said to me too, that 3 days seems the right amount of time. They weren't all practicing Tibetan Buddhism, but that was their experience with families. And I love that dream. It made me a little teary hearing it. Just, I love that dream about you were helping him cross nonetheless.
It made me wonder, what came first, the religious tradition or maybe something deeper within our psyche that, kind of allows our mind to process. And it's like, did the religious
Mm.
traditions, have they shaped that in us over the years, or did they actually develop out of that?
And it is interesting to me too, like you do this once and the next time do you realize what works, what doesn't work?
Yeah. I wanted to share that in rereading the article, I was struck by a few things. First of all, how perfectly you captured my parents in just a very concise way. You described my mom as a lover of nature, spontaneity, and books. And my dad as having a penchant for plaid button downs and reading glasses perched above his bald head. And reading those descriptions just made me chuckle because they were so spot on. You also brought back moments that I'd forgotten from the experience, like leading my daughter Lila over to my mom's body and how she placed her stuffed dog Max on her belly before holding her hand, and how Miles suggested that we all hold hands and say, "We love you, Nana," in unison. And you noticed the rose oil that we added to the water, and that was a scent that I had often used to massage my mom's temples, and that Lila and I picked out her outfit together, and that my brother and I shared a joke. Just all these little details. So, reading it again really reminded me of what a gift this article has been for our family and how it really recorded something sacred we shared and that we went through as a family.
Oh, I'm glad.
I remember when Heidi, the death doula, told me you were working on a story about home funerals and asked if we'd be open to being part of it. It felt vulnerable, but also so important because I really wanted to share this story. It felt like a way to honor my mom, but also a way to make something more of her death that would also support others.
I think that's so important. As a journalist, I'm only as good as people who are willing to be open. And I got that sense early on. And I was so lucky to talk to your mom and be able to include her thoughts about all this in the story and that she was so on board with it. I sometimes say when I'm reporting a story, I wouldn't talk to me. I don't know that I could have had somebody in my house at that time. I'm not necessarily as brave as your family was. I mean, I'm on the East Coast and you were in California. We'd never met. It wasn't like I could just pop over and have coffee with you, or you had lots of time while your mom was sick. So the leap of faith is so important. There's no story without your family.
I think the most important thing to me in that experience was making sure that it was comfortable for my kids. And luckily, they did feel very comfortable with you. But I kind of remember there was like a couple moments where I wanted to sort of protect them from feeling like they were being accessed because already being accessed by adults about their feelings at that age wasn't something that little kids tend to prefer. And then on top of that, to have it be in such a vulnerable moment. But I think we really were able to strike that balance. So it worked out.
Yeah, and I've done a lot of reporting on kids and teens, and you have to be really careful. I mean, I wasn't going to go in with them and ask them a ton of questions.
Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah.
was just wanted to sort of experience them in the space and with your mom and with you. But nobody wants to be grilled in those moments, and kids really don't want to be grilled in those moments.
Especially. Yeah. When I think about how you reached out to us and imagine you doing that with each of the other families, I'm so struck by your bravery, how you enter these heartbreaking spaces in order to tell these stories. And I remember when you first had a call with my mom, we had a call and you spoke with my family and you spoke with my mom. And I'm sure you had to go through that with all of the other families. And I'm just wondering how difficult it is for you to make those kinds of calls.
There are certain phone calls I really dread as a reporter, and what I find hard is that people are putting their trust in me, and they're also telling me about some of their greatest pains.
Mhm. I think that our family might be the only one where you spoke with us before the person had passed. And you have a mix of people in the story, going through very different kinds of experiences. And so I'm just curious if that just kind of came together spontaneously or if you consciously kind of chose these different types of stories.
It's a combination. I mean, there are a lot of people who are not in the story in the end. So some people who I talked to, they may have been in the story in little bits, but the person had died and then they either didn't want me or they kind of forgot about it. It was a weird kind of story because I'm waiting for a phone call from somebody to say that their loved one died and it would be okay to continue reporting. But I wanted a variety of experiences because I didn't want to suggest there's one way to do this. And there's not one kind of death. I mean, that felt important to me too. This is not just about your parent who's 90 and has been at home for 5 years. And oh, sure, that makes it sound like it's easy to have a home funeral. As we talked about before, there were kids, there were people in their 20s. So the variety of experiences was both to show that it's not one kind of death that makes for a home funeral and that it's not about one religion or one belief system or that it all is done in the same 3-day way with a home funeral guide, that people can do it in all sorts of ways.
Yeah. And I know that you mentioned to me that you felt it was important that our family kind of seemed like a pretty regular family and that, you wanted people to feel that it was accessible. One of the things that allows us not to have to have a relationship with death or to think about death is we can imagine that it's something that happens to sick, old people. But of course, until then, the tragedy hits and we can kind of go on like sort of in denial of death when there's actually a lot of value in keeping death close. And the death positive movement is all about how we can do that, how death can inform how we live and remind us of what matters. It's about being able to plan for death, talk about death, make space for it, participate in it. Much like the home birth movement, it's about reclaiming important life passages that we've handed over to institutions. And so I think that by showing the range, it kind of hopefully contributing to that sense of like, this is something that affects us all at every stage of life.
Yeah, and I actually think when you live that way, it takes some of the fear out of death because it's not something you've just shoved away. I mean, lots of us assume we're going to live until our 80s and 90s, and that's just not statistically true for everyone. And I think about death a lot more than I used to because of age, but also because I try to, and because this story helped me do that. And I did love your family in part because I wanted people not to feel you had to be a Tibetan Buddhist, you have to be from some woo-woo community in California. I wanted it to feel like you too, dear reader, can do this and find help to do this if it's too hard to do on your own.
And we're from Ohio originally,
That's right, I forgot
the real America.
that.
So I wanted to mention that you wrote a short piece called How Talking to the Dead Dislodged Some of My Sorrow. I really love that piece. Could you tell the listeners a little bit about it?
Yeah, my mom, she'd had a stroke, so it was not a sudden death, but it was devastating for me. I really was close to her and loved her. And in the months after she died, it was COVID, my kids were cooped up in the house. Like there was so much going on that I felt like I couldn't quite access my grief. I guess I'd mentioned that to my sister. She talked about that my mom still had her cell phone number, and I started leaving her messages. I would hear her voice, which would sort of prompt me in a way. And I would just leave messages on her voicemail. And somehow it felt more helpful than just talking to her, which I had done with my father and I do now with her. It's more of an internal talking, but it was the speaking aloud. It was that I would call her about kind of the end of a deadline. I'd call her about big things. I so missed our conversations. So I did
Mm.
that for several months. And then as I write about it, was sort of this transition object. And then, not unlike having a body at home, it's something that allowed me to sort of move on.
I wanted to bring that in because there are a lot of different ways that we can keep a relationship with our dead ones. If ever since my mom passed away, I have an altar and it has her ashes on it and there's a candle. And I regularly light the candle, and I'll even say to the kids, I want to invite Nana in and like feel her energy and feel her presence. And I keep flowers on it. It's a chest that was in our family home. So when I touch it, I feel like this sense of connection to her because it belonged to her mother. And similarly to your story about your mom, I do now with my dad because it's only been a few weeks or a month since he passed away. And I will go into his room, which still really has the energy of him in it, even though we've moved out a lot of the furniture and everything. I'll open my dad's door and I'll say, Hi, Dad. And I say it just in the voice that I would say it in. And it was like by doing that, I could hear him back. And I could hear him say, oh, hello, my darling, just in his bright voice and his warm smile. And then I would just imagine kind of chit chatting with him, checking in, and then telling him, like, okay, well, I'm going to go pick up Lila at school now. And I've done that a few times, and it's just this sort of enacting of the interaction that we often had on a daily basis. And I don't know, I like doing it.
I totally get it. It does not sound strange to me, and I think we should be doing more of that. I mean, I have a friend whose father recently died, and she's writing letters to him, and I was like, "That makes so much sense." I mean, partly what you miss, whether it's a spouse or a parent or friend, is the day-to-day-ness of it. I mean, that's why I was saying, my messages to my mother weren't all about, "Oh my god, I miss you so much." It was like,
Mhm,
Lucia's playing soccer and Addie's in college and she has your picture on her desk. And it was a recounting of things I knew she would like.
mhm.
Another way, I mean, that seems so obvious, but I know some people don't do this, is I am constantly telling stories about my mom who my kids knew and my dad who they didn't. And, my daughter just had sent pictures of her graduation from college, and she's got this white dress with applique flowers. And I immediately say, oh my gosh, Nana would be all over that dress. She loved applique flowers. It's
Mhm.
just it's for me and it's for them and their voices inside of her. I'm sure your kids are the same way. So it's both the conversation and the conversation with others. And, I'm sure you and I want to be remembered that way too. I want my kids to tell stories about me and to keep me alive for themselves.
What I always talk with my kids about is when we're out on a trail or on a hike or even just out in the neighborhood walking our dog and people go by, I always greet them very brightly and friendly. And I mean, I'm normally a fairly friendly person, but my mom was very gregarious and outgoing, and she would strike up a conversation with anyone on an elevator or at a, cash register or restaurant. And so I kind of make a conscious point of being that way in the world, and that in doing that, I kind of feel her living through me.
Absolutely. I love that. And maybe that too could help us be a little less scared of death, that you do live on.
One thing that was so wonderful about the opportunity with my dad, and when someone's dying, you get to have those conversations. And I learned from my father that he wasn't afraid of death, that he felt he had lived fully. And, he said it came sooner than I expected, but I'm okay with it because I've lived a full life.
I think my mom felt the same way. And, she was also in pain. But I mean, I was about to say, I'm envious of that feeling. And I assume that some of that comes with age. My mom had said for quite a while that she was not really scared of death. And she was religious. And I think that helped. But I think that's a wonderful gift.
I want to move on to talking about your writing more broadly, but I do want to share one more moment with you, which is that when the article came out, my dad came down the hallway from his room. I was in my living room, and he said, Did you read it yet? And I said, Yes. And we both embraced and cried. And he said, I think she handled it really well, don't you? And I agreed completely. And we both just felt grateful. And I'll admit a little relieved that letting you in resulted in something so meaningful.
It makes me so very happy that you and your dad reacted that way.
Well, I'm glad to have the chance to share it with you in person. So, turning the lens a little bit, as I mentioned earlier, you've written about many taboo subjects from teen suicide to sex after 70 and online dating after 50. And I'm wondering what in your mind kind of connects these subjects.
So, I've always been interested and mostly have been able to write about people who I think are underheard from in the news media. And, sometimes that's been undocumented immigrants, sometimes it's been about kids in trouble in various ways, or I've written a lot about adoptees. And I think over time and with age, I've not even consciously sort of shifted in thinking, what are the subjects that both interest me and that are taboo? And that death article had really made a lot of people think. And talk about subjects that were right there, but weren't really supposed to be shared. The Sex Over 70, my editor and I kind of cooked that up together. And, we don't have really addressed sex and aging. We're not supposed to think that anybody has sex over a certain age. I don't know what that age exactly is.
Mhm.
Probably changes as you grow up. You think it's like, oh, we're 50 at some point, and then it's 60, then it's 70, then it's 80.
I think there's this thread of kind of returning to the body, not the idealized body, but the real body in different stages of our lives. And one of the things I thought was interesting about the Sex Over 70 article was when you talked about nursing homes and how they're trying to find ethical and safe and consensual ways for people in nursing care to be able to still have sexual lives and how much it increases the quality of their life. But they're infantilized and they're kept in these separate rooms and they're not allowed to visit, unsupervised, and they have to be back into their rooms at certain times and so forth. So they really lose their autonomy.
Yes, and it's partly nursing homes are worried about being sued, but what really struck me was the director of a long-term care facility saying to me, "It's often the kids who really infantilize their parents." And, of course, when dementia is involved and other things like that, you have to be really careful, but even then, it doesn't mean people can't have sex to protect people and make sure it's consensual, but that idea that we don't wanna know about it, they shouldn't be having it. It's absurd. I mean, it's so lucky if somebody meets somebody in old age and they get to have sex with them. We should be celebrating it.
And by the way, you spoke about if we're going to cover these topics, being really detailed and really honest. And I have to say, I mean, the detail you went into in the Sex Over 70 article and the conversations you had with people about how they were having sex and what they were finding pleasure in. And I love that there was no tee-heeing about it, that it was just really treated with a lot of respect and also informative for people who maybe don't know, like, how can I have a sexual relationship now that things have changed with my body? And what can that look like now?
And it needs to be detailed because part of the point of that story is the old ways may not work. And that doesn't mean you stop having sex, which is what happens with a lot of people. The couple who starts out in the story, he was so detailed. And I kept thinking, I can't believe he's telling me all this. And he was so kind of into it. And then his wife, who was much shyer, was also willing to do it. And it was also about struggles that they've had in their marriage, which is like, in your
Mhm.
80s, welcome to the club. But I'm so grateful to people who are willing to talk, and so many people were, and I think that again goes to, yeah, nobody wants to hear about this normally.
I imagine that part of the reason why people are willing to talk is similar to why we were willing to, because you feel like you've discovered something that's outside the norm that is actually really wonderful, and you wanna share it with others because you know it can enrich their lives.
Yes, often the subjects who are best to interview are people who sort of have a little bit of a mission about some of these things, that they get that it's beyond their story, that it's also something that can help others. And I did think of that piece as partly, what we call in journalism a service piece of just full of sort of practical information. And, there was a study in there. It's basically about good sex and it includes people of all age ranges, but a lot of people had disabilities, and in fact, their sex life became better because they learned new ways of having sex.
I have to say I love that the whole article was illustrated. I think all the photos were from Marilyn Minter.
Yes.
Well, I wanted to move on to the article about online dating, and the title of that is Online Dating After 50 Can Be Miserable But Also Liberating. So I think many of us can imagine why it's miserable, but could you talk about what's so liberating about online dating after 50?
What's liberating is partly it was a little bit based on a group of friends I have, who are widowed or divorced, and other women in particular. It was a pretty women-centered story because it had a first-person quality to it, and for some people, they'd never had a good sex life, and they were sort of starting all over again, going beyond where they had been. I think there's something about being over 50 and being more honest about who you are with yourself and others. People would say, yeah, and so what if I get rejected for my interests, sexual or otherwise, because, okay, I'll live, worse things have happened. There is just a greater frankness. And part of the liberation, too, is that there aren't the same sort of self-imposed rules about, is this person going to be a good parent? Does this person have enough money? Are my parents going to like them? There were a lot more people who probably wouldn't have match with their partner in their 20s. And some of those things that mattered back then don't matter so much anymore.
Yeah, and you mentioned that most people don't even want to get remarried. And in fact, that many people are doing this, I think you called it living together apart, like even married couples who don't actually live with one another because they really enjoy having their separate homes. And that's how my dad and his partner Kathleen were. Like my dad was here with us. He got to be with his grandchildren part of the week, but then he would go and be with her. And then, they each got to have their periods of solitude.
Yeah.
And so I love that.
So this is a little bit gendered. Women are much less interested in getting married again. And one sociologist said, marriage hasn't served women as well as it served men. What's not so liberating for men, I think, is men tend not to have the deep friendships that women have. So women aren't looking to get everything from a partner. They have multiple sources of companionship, friendship. And if you've gone through a divorce, for lots of people, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm not getting that entangled again.
There's a couple of quotes that you shared from people you interviewed for this article. And one is from Jenny Young. And she says, "Our hormones are shifting. We have zero tolerance, especially those of us who have been on our own and don't feel we need a man to provide for us." And you quote Sophia Chang, who says, "If I bat my eyes, I could go further, but for what? There's no sense in wasting time when life is growing short." And I really loved that. There was a lot of talk in the article about women actually, instead of kind of widening the lens in order to cast a wider net, and is getting more specific and clear about what they really want so they don't waste their time.
Yeah, I mean, because, this is why this stuff circles back to death too. It's like, time is finite. And, Jenny Young has this whole dating method called burned haystack, which is like, be picky. Don't spend your time in conversation with somebody who gave you 5 red flags from their dating profile. Time is finite. And, what may be fun for a little bit gets tiresome. And it's also time to reprioritize. Maybe you want to live with your best friends.
I love that you connected it back to the death conversation because I was thinking about that as well. When we are older, we just automatically have that happen as part of our aging, that we become more aware of our mortality as our parents die and then friends begin to get old and or sick and die. And having that awareness makes us prioritize our time more and really reminds us of what matters most.
I mean, this all goes back to sex and death and aging too. I mean, your body's changing. There are reminders all the time, and it's worthwhile paying attention to them because they help you live.
Yeah. Has writing about these subjects influenced the way you move through your own life?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's why I love my job. The death story has completely influenced me, and I really do try to make a practice of reminding myself about death. One of my favorite apps is We Croak, which has 5 little quotes, poems, etc., that are related to death. And then the sex and aging, I'm so inspired by the women that I've talked to and the men for both the sex over 70 and the dating over 50 about just a certain truth that I think happens with age of, you're not trying to be a jerk, but being frank and being honest and feeling like this is the time we have. There's no guarantee of anything. And so we want to live as richly as we can, which is not hedonistically or in a self-centered way. It's about giving, but it's also about saying what you think, saying what you feel, hopefully caring less and less and less about being liked.
I don't know if I ever told you this, but after going through this whole experience, I actually went through an end of life training program to become a death doula. And it was through this organization called Going with Grace, which is founded by Alua Arthur.
Hmm.
I didn't have any intention of becoming a death doula, but I just did it because I was interested in learning more about the whole experience and just thinking about the death positive movement. And maybe even thinking a little bit about how, if I could deepen my knowledge and understanding of it, how that might come into my coaching, because I work primarily with women in midlife. So a lot of women like the ones that you've been interviewing for these articles.
Yeah.
So, I know you talked about how these stories that you cover are a lot about people who have been marginalized and topics that are taboo. But I also wanted to just say that I feel like they're also about being fully alive, which means including the difficult and painful parts of our life. And I really love that because for me, as a life coach and just in my personal life, being open to what we call the shadow in Jungian psychology, being willing to welcome those rejected parts so that we can become integrated and whole. I feel like these topics kind of resonate with that for me. And I really value that.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly it's what both of the 2 topics about death and sex that we've been talking about, and I like the idea of looking at things face on and giving language to it and being able to talk to people about it and being able to hear people talk about it. I think darkness always has such negative connotations, but it's not. I mean, it's part of living, it's part of life, and being less afraid of that does feel like
Yeah.
a better, a richer way to live.
Well, in Jungian psychology, when they talk about the shadow, a lot of people think of this dark, kind of looming negative thing, and that's what it becomes because we ignore it. But really, all shadow means is out of our conscious awareness that it's kind of been repressed and rejected. And actually, it becomes less dark and less threatening when we welcome it in. I feel like that's what these kinds of conversations help us do.
Exactly.
I've now had the experience of tending both my mother and father during and after their deaths, as have you. And what I've come to feel is that death doesn't just take, that it gives us something. And slowing down and staying close and washing and dressing and witnessing, that we're offered this profound reminder of how fragile and precious life is.
Just wholly agreeing. I mean, I'm sure you feel this way. I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything. And sometimes I'm not even quite sure exactly what they've done for me, except that they kind of deepen my relationship with death, but with that person, they feel being in those kind of intimate moments. I mean, I just feel like that's what a rich life is about. Embracing that kind of intimacy.
Absolutely. And I don't want to detract from the fact that being there and present with your dying loved one is incredibly painful. And I still feel like I'm processing some of the trauma from my dad's just lungs being full of fluid and gasping, and kind of looking afraid. And I'm assured by the hospice nurses that they don't have the same conscious awareness of it and that it's not painful, but I'm not really sure how they could know that. And I'm, worrying about it. And it's awful to witness, and it's really hard, but it's worth it, I think is the point.
No, Suzanne, I think it's really important that you said that because we don't wanna romanticize what it's like. That's what it was like with my father too, and death rattle is not pretty. But once again, like, the more you know about it, the more you've educated yourself or a hospice person has, it's a little less scary, but it's the person that you love and adore and don't want taken from you. That's how I always feel, like, somebody show me the
Yeah.
evidence that they're not suffering and the endorphins all get released. I wanna believe it, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say though that what was beautiful about that experience was that when he took his last gasps, my brother and I were on either side of him, holding either one of his hands, and I know that he looked over at each of our faces and he knew that we were there, and that being there and being present with him, it means the world to me. Whatever pain he was going through, whatever I might not have been able to spare him from, at least he knew we were there.
Yeah. No, I think it's a total gift, and not everybody can be there. I mean, I said this in the story, and I think that's why and not everybody gets to have a body. Terrible things happen,
Yeah.
fires, all sorts of things. This isn't possible for everybody. I mean, only my oldest sister and I were there at the moment my mother died, and then one was en route, but that's why having her body at home was also so important because
Yeah.
not everybody can be there, but you can still be tending to them in some way,
Right.
in the
Yeah.
hours after death.
Yeah, rather than just getting the call, getting the notice, and then the next time you see them, they're in a funeral home, you know?
Right, right.
And again, wanna also just say that anyone who chooses to do it that way and who would prefer to do it that way, like, it's totally okay, but, just wanting to just invite people into the possibility of the richness that can come from spending more time with our dead loved ones.
Right, and you can consider it and reject it, but at least you know that there are different options for you out there.
Well, I wanted to end with a quote from Frank Ostaseski, who wrote the book The Five Invitations: Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully, which is such a beautiful book. Here's the quote. He says, "We can harness the awareness of death to appreciate the fact that we are alive, to encourage self exploration, to clarify our values, to find meaning, and to generate positive action. It is the impermanence of life that gives us perspective. As we come in contact with life's precarious nature, we also come to appreciate its preciousness. Then we don't want to waste a minute. We want to enter our lives fully and use them in a responsible way. Death is a good companion on the road to living well and dying without regret."
I love that.
So, Maggie, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I so appreciate your witnessing and your grace and your care. Your work helps return something essential to our culture. and I'm deeply grateful.
I'm so grateful. It's so nice to reconnect. Thanks for having me, Suzanne.
This has been The Deepening with Suzanne LaRue. If you enjoy conversations that lead you deeper into self and soul, I invite you to subscribe, follow, and tune in for future episodes. Thanks for joining us.